When policy gridlock finally breaks, the political system tips over and establishes a new center of gravity. What was controversial rapidly becomes the accepted baseline. In 2010, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, opinion polls showed a clear majority of Americans opposed the legislation. Yet by January 2017, as lawmakers mounted aggressive efforts to repeal the law, preferences had flipped. A new majority favored Obamacare, effectively killing the repeal efforts. The standard political science explanation for why policies are difficult to change relies on institutional friction. Theories like Keith Krehbiel's pivotal politics argue that veto points, filibusters, bicameralism, executive vetoes, act as a supermajority threshold, creating a strong bias toward the status quo. But institutional hurdles only explain why laws are hard to pass or repeal in a legislature. They do not explain why the electorate's actual preferences flipped after the policy went into effect. The canonical framework for understanding elections, the Downesian spatial median voter model, struggles with this anomaly. The standard model assumes that voter preferences are state-independent. In that framework, the policy outcome simply tracks the median voter, and the current status quo is completely irrelevant to what a voter mathematically desires. To solve the paradox, we have to borrow a behavioral variable from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's prospect theory, loss aversion. Individuals process outcomes not as final states of welfare, but as relative gains and losses. And psychologically, losses loom larger than equivalent gains. Integrating this cognitive baseline into spatial voting models reveals a different set of mechanics. Status quo bias, voter preference moderation, and policy entrenchment emerge organically from individual cognition, operating entirely independently of institutional veto gates. We begin with the standard equation for a voter's indirect utility. Without behavioral factors, utility is simply the material benefits of a policy minus its costs. This chart maps ideal policies, or bliss points, across a continuous distribution of voter types. The smooth, rising dotted line represents mathematically ideal policies for different voters, assuming no loss aversion. Higher types prefer higher policies. Now we introduce the status quo. This horizontal line represents the current policy. It serves as a psychological reference point. Voters unbundle the costs and benefits of any new proposal based purely on how it departs from this specific line. Because human psychology weighs losses more heavily than gains, we inject a decomposable loss aversion parameter, lambda, into the equation. A move away from the status quo exacts a disproportionate psychological cost, multiplying the perceived material loss by 1 plus lambda. Taking the first-order condition of this new utility equation changes the geometry of voter preferences. The marginal cost of moving away from the status quo spikes drastically, distorting the previously smooth curve. The visual result is this completely flattened center section along the status quo axis. This is the inertia interval, bounded by t check on the left and t hat on the right. For any voter who falls within this flat interval, their mathematically ideal policy is strictly the current status quo, even if their material preference would normally dictate a slightly higher or lower policy. The psychological cost of loss neutralizes it, disabling incremental change. This also exerts a moderation effect on the periphery. Because sensitivity to losses outweighs gains, the ideal policies of extreme voters are pulled closer to the center, dampening overall polarization. Status quo bias is therefore a mathematical certainty arising directly from the geometry of the revised utility curve. For a policy change to actually occur under this model, an exogenous shock to voter preferences must be large enough to push the median voter completely outside the inertia interval. This graph shows what happens when that shock hits. We have the exact same electorate, but we subject them to two distinct starting status quos. The median voter's new bliss point is magnetically dragged in the direction of their initial baseline. A higher initial status quo yields a higher final policy choice, proving strict path dependence. This creates a political endowment effect. Once a controversial reform, like the Affordable Care Act, barely passes, it immediately resets the model. The new policy acts as the new reference point. A preference recalculation takes place across the electorate. Voters left of the median, who initially preferred a lower policy, become accustomed to the new baseline. They begin to view any repeal as a psychological loss of the benefits they just gained. Reverting to the older policy now requires overcoming these newly recruited defenders. A simple majority is no longer sufficient to roll back the law, because the mass of voters who prefer to maintain the new status quo has artificially expanded. The final outcome of any policy reform is inextricably tethered to the electorate's initial psychological baseline. Past policies entrench future outcomes. This cognitive geometry also reveals how biological time dictates political volatility. By extending the model to overlapping generations, we can see that a voter's residual time horizon acts as a mathematical discount factor on their perceived loss aversion. If a young voter expects to live for n future periods, their perceived loss aversion is simply lambda divided by n. This chart illustrates two demographic distributions reacting to the exact same policy proposal. We have an older cohort perceiving the full weight of lambda and a younger cohort perceiving only half that weight. Notice the difference in the size of the inertia intervals. The older demographic has a massive status quo bias, while the younger demographic's interval is highly compressed. The logic is straightforward. The psychological cost of abandoning the status quo is borne entirely today. But young voters can amortize the material benefits of a better policy over decades of future periods, diluting the initial pain of the change. This creates a mathematical conflict zone. When the median voter falls into this gap, young voters demand a policy change, while older voters demand the status quo. The defining variable becomes the birth rate. A higher birth rate expands the share of young voters, dragging the pivotal voter away from the status quo and toward reform. Demographically older societies are mathematically locked into a wider status quo bias, while younger societies are structurally prone to higher policy volatility and radical reform. Abstracting this logic out to electoral competition requires a partisan model, specifically the Whitman-Calvert framework. Candidates are policy-motivated, trading off ideal preferences against the probability of actually winning a seat. A spatial voting spectrum places left and right-wing platforms on either side of an indifferent cutoff voter. Loss aversion moderates extreme preferences, forcing candidates into tighter convergence. They must close the gap to capture this concentrated center to win. But elections are not isolated events. Winning today resets the reference point for tomorrow. If a right-wing party wins, the status quo line shifts to the right, and the cutoff voters' distribution warps entirely toward that new baseline. The left-wing party faces a severe dilemma. Their electoral leverage collapses as voters become terrified of losing their new right-wing baseline. Fearing an inevitable loss, the left-wing platform abandons its ideal point, shifting rightward just to remain statistically competitive. This dynamic generates a long-term cycle in politics. The expected policy outcomes drift continuously in the direction of the incumbent's past victories, forcing the opposition to adapt to the winner's reality. When Bill Clinton took office, he moved the Democratic platform significantly to the right, embracing pro-market policies to accommodate the post-Reagan status quo bias. Similarly, Tony Blair shifted New Labour to the center of the spectrum to accommodate the economic baseline entrenched by Margaret Thatcher. Loss aversion determines the long-term trajectory of power. By anchoring voters to current policy, it creates the incumbency advantages and partisan cycles that make political institutions so resistant to change.